Have you ever woken up with the unsettling feeling that you had been somewhere else, as if you were just pulled back into your body, but whatever happened there vanished too quickly to name? Not a random dream, not mental noise, more like a return from a place that felt real in a way ordinary thoughts don't. That sensation isn't accidental, and it isn't meaningless. What if I told you that your consciousness may be more active while you're asleep than when you're awake? That sleep is not a shutdown, but a shift into a state you were never taught to recognize or understand. From the moment we're young, we're taught that sleep is just rest, a pause in awareness. But what if that's incomplete? What if every night your consciousness doesn't disappear at all but goes somewhere else? Science already admits something that quietly destabilizes everything we were taught about sleep and consciousness. Awareness does not collapse just because the brain changes its activity pattern. For decades, the dominant model assumed that consciousness was a simple byproduct of neuronal firing, like heat from an engine. Turn the engine down, the heat fades. Sleep, in this view, was little more than a dimming of the lights. But modern research has been forcing a more uncomfortable question into the open. What if the lights don't turn off at all, but move to another room? One of the most unsettling clues comes from REM sleep, the phase where dreams are most vivid. During REM, large portions of the brain associated with rational control and sensory filtering quiet down, while regions linked to imagery, emotion, and internal narrative become intensely active. From the outside, the sleeper appears disconnected. From the inside, however, entire worlds unfold. People navigate environments, solve problems, feel fear or awe, and sometimes experience a sense of identity that feels continuous with waking life. If consciousness were merely the sum of sensory input and logical processing, this shouldn't be possible. Yet it happens every night. Even more challenging are cases where conscious experience seems to persist when brain activity is drastically reduced. Studies of near-death experiences have documented reports of clear awareness, structured memory, and coherent perception occurring during periods when measurable brain activity is minimal or severely disrupted. Neuroscience does not deny these reports, it struggles to fully explain them. The standard response is cautious language, residual activity, unknown mechanisms, memory reconstruction. But beneath that caution is an implicit admission. The relationship between brain activity and consciousness is not one-to-one. This has led some researchers to propose a shift in perspective. Instead of viewing the brain as the producer of consciousness, they explore the possibility that it functions more like a regulator or filter. In this model, consciousness is not created inside the skull, but shaped by it, constrained by it, tuned by it. When you are awake, the brain is optimized for survival, filtering information, prioritizing threats, maintaining a stable sense of self. During sleep, many of these constraints loosen. The filter relaxes. What comes through may feel strange, symbolic, or non-linear, but it is not necessarily less real in experiential terms. There is a simple observation you can make that hints at this. Think about the moment just before falling asleep, when thoughts begin to drift without your deliberate control. Images arise that you didn't choose. Insights sometimes surface fully formed, without effort. If consciousness were strictly dependent on focused brain control, this transition should feel like fading into nothing. Instead, it often feels like slipping into a different mode of knowing. Something continues, even as the usual mental supervisor clocks out. Neuroscience also recognizes phenomena like paradoxical sleep, where the brain shows patterns similar to wakefulness, while the body is completely paralyzed. From the outside, nothing is happening. Internally, consciousness can be intensely alive. This challenges the assumption that observable responsiveness equals awareness. It suggests that consciousness can be present without outward expression, without movement, without interaction with the physical environment. Importantly, none of this requires mystical language. These are empirical observations that push against a simplistic material model. Researchers studying anesthesia have found cases where patients later report awareness, despite appearing fully unconscious by all clinical measures. Others investigate how psychedelics, meditation, and sensory deprivation can radically alter conscious experience without corresponding increases in basic brain energy consumption. The brain changes configuration, not volume. The signal is reorganized, not necessarily amplified. Sleep fits neatly into this pattern. It is a nightly reconfiguration of the system. The networks that anchor you to linear time, social identity, and physical surroundings loosen their grip. Other networks, less constrained by external input, take the lead. From a purely scientific standpoint, this already suggests that consciousness is more flexible, more context-dependent than we were taught. It adapts to different operational modes. Here is where a subtle but crucial distinction matters. Science does not claim that consciousness floats freely, independent of the brain. What it increasingly acknowledges is that the brain may not be the sole origin point. Dependency is not the same as identity. A radio depends on its hardware to play music, but the music is not manufactured by the circuits themselves. Damage the radio, and the sound distorts or disappears. That does not mean the broadcast never existed beyond the device. During waking life, the broadcast is tightly synchronized with the physical world. During sleep, synchronization shifts. The channel changes. This may explain why experiences during sleep often feel symbolic, emotionally charged, or timeless. The brain is no longer enforcing the same rules of coherence it uses during daylight consciousness. This reframing opens a door without forcing us to walk through it blindly. If consciousness can remain active when the brain is in radically different states, then sleep is not simply absence. It is a change in how awareness is organized and accessed. And once you accept that, another question naturally follows. If sleep alters the filter rather than shutting it down, what kinds of information, perception, or insight become available when the usual constraints are lifted? You were taught to believe that sleep is simply rest because that explanation is convenient. It fits an industrial idea of the human being as a machine that works, overheats, and then powers down to recover. In that model, sleep exists only to recharge the body so productivity can resume. But this framing leaves too many things unexplained. It doesn't account for why sleep deprivation alters personality before it weakens muscles, why insight often arrives in the morning instead of during effort, or why certain truths seem to surface only when control loosens. Rest is part of the story, but it is not the story. If sleep were merely rest, it would resemble inactivity. Yet the sleeping brain is anything but inactive. Energy consumption drops only slightly, while internal communication becomes more complex. Memory is reorganized, emotional residues are processed, and patterns from waking life are reassembled in unfamiliar forms. What looks like shutdown from the outside is closer to a systems update on the inside. The body may lie still, but something is clearly at work. Notice how language betrays the deeper intuition people already have. We say we fall asleep, drift off, or go to sleep, as if movement were involved. We speak of deep sleep and light sleep, using spatial metaphors that have nothing to do with rest. Even waking carries the sense of return, as though consciousness had been elsewhere and is now re-entering the surface world. These expressions persist because they reflect lived experience more accurately than the official explanation. There is also the matter of timing. Some of your most restorative nights leave you physically tired but mentally clear, while other nights provide hours of unconsciousness, and yet you wake feeling fragmented. If sleep were only about physical recovery, duration would be the main variable. But quality matters more than quantity. Something has to align. That alignment is not muscular, it is internal, structural, almost architectural. Sleep reorganizes the inner space you inhabit. Consider what happens to the sense of self during sleep. The rigid narrative you carry while awake, your name, your role, your unfinished tasks, loosens its grip. Identity becomes fluid. You may observe yourself from the outside, inhabit another body, or exist without a clear form at all. This is not rest in the ordinary sense. It is a temporary suspension of the psychological scaffolding that holds your waking personality together. When that scaffolding relaxes, other aspects of awareness step forward. From a biological perspective, this makes sense. The brain evolved not just to keep the body alive, but to integrate experience across time. Sleep provides the conditions for that integration to occur without the pressure of immediate response. During the day, attention is pulled outward, fragmented by demands. At night, attention turns inward by default. The organism is no longer negotiating with the environment, it is renegotiating with itself. This is why dreams often exaggerate emotion and compress meaning. They are not entertainment. They are a language used when linear thought is offline. Sleep allows information that would be filtered out during wakefulness to surface in symbolic form. That symbolism is not random. It is the mind's way of working without the constraints of social logic and sensory dominance. Rest alone would not require such complexity. There is also a quieter function that often goes unnoticed. Sleep recalibrates perception. After a good night's sleep, colors appear sharper, sounds less abrasive, problems more proportionate. Nothing external has changed, yet the world feels different. That shift suggests that sleep adjusts the internal reference point through which reality is interpreted. It is less like charging a battery and more like retuning an instrument. This idea challenges a deeply ingrained assumption that consciousness must remain stable to be reliable. In fact, stability can become rigidity. Sleep introduces controlled instability. It disrupts habitual patterns just enough to prevent the system from locking into narrow loops. That disruption is essential. Without it, perception hardens, emotions stagnate, and thinking becomes repetitive. Sleep restores flexibility, not just energy. When you view sleep through this lens, the common advice to just get more rest starts to feel incomplete. The question is not only how long you sleep, but how you enter sleep, what state of mind you carry with you, and how abruptly or gently you return. These transitions matter because sleep is a passage, not a pause. The threshold between waking and sleeping is not a switch, it is a gradient. This naturally leads to a deeper implication. If sleep is a shift in how consciousness operates rather than a shutdown, then the brain must be changing modes, not turning off. Different patterns of activity, different rhythms, different internal priorities come online. What we call rest may simply be the surface effect of a much more fundamental transformation happening beneath awareness. And once you begin to see sleep as a change in mode rather than a break in function, another question starts to take shape. If consciousness reorganizes itself every night, moving away from sensory dominance and linear control, then what exactly determines where it goes next? The answer may lie not in how much the brain rests, but in how its internal rhythms shift and synchronize as you cross into sleep. During sleep, your brain accesses deeper layers of reality, not because it becomes more powerful, but because it becomes less restrictive. While you are awake, your brain acts like a strict gatekeeper. It prioritizes survival, filters perception, suppresses ambiguity, and keeps your sense of reality tightly aligned with physical space and linear time. This is useful for navigating daily life, but it is not the full range of what the brain can process. When sleep begins, that gatekeeping role softens, and perception is allowed to reorganize itself in ways that would be impractical, even destabilizing during the day. This is where the idea of deeper layers needs to be understood carefully. It does not mean hidden fantasy worlds or mystical realms detached from biology. It means layers of information, association, and perception that are normally overshadowed by sensory input and conscious control. During sleep, especially in deeper stages, the brain reduces its reliance on external signals and amplifies internal ones. Memory, emotion, imagination, and pattern recognition stop competing with the outside world and start interacting with each other directly. Brainwave activity reflects this shift clearly. As you move from wakefulness into sleep, electrical rhythms slow and synchronize. Fast, fragmented beta waves give way to alpha, then theta, and eventually delta waves. This slowing is not a loss of intelligence, it is a change in bandwidth. Slower waves allow distant neural networks to coordinate. Information that is usually processed in separate compartments begins to blend. This is why dreams feel nonlinear and symbolic. The brain is no longer translating experience into practical action, it is exploring relationships. Think of waking consciousness as a spotlight. It illuminates what is immediately useful and leaves the rest in shadow. Sleep replaces the spotlight with ambient light. The edges become visible. Subtle connections emerge. Emotional residues from the day combine with older memories, future concerns, and abstract ideas. The result can feel strange, but it often carries a depth that waking thought struggles to reach. People don't usually wake up from sleep with step-by-step plans. They wake up with clarity, perspective, or a sense that something has shifted. This is why certain insights only arrive when you stop trying to think. Problems that resisted logic during the day sometimes resolve themselves overnight. The brain is not resting from cognition, it is using a different cognitive strategy. Instead of linear analysis, it engages in associative synthesis. It tests scenarios, recombines experiences, and explores meaning without the pressure to be immediately correct. Neuroscience has observed that during these sleep states, the default mode network, associated with self-referential thought and internal awareness, becomes highly active. At the same time, regions responsible for external orientation and executive control step back. This creates a condition where awareness is turned inward but not shut down. You are not unconscious in the way a powered-off device is unconscious. You are conscious without an audience, without a task, without a fixed point of reference. This inward orientation can feel like depth because it removes the surface noise. During the day, perception is constantly interrupted. Notifications, conversations, expectations, and self-monitoring fragment attention. At night, attention is continuous. Even when dreams shift rapidly, there is an underlying coherence that holds the experience together. Time stretches or collapses. Scenes change without explanation. And yet, within the experience itself, it often feels natural. Another overlooked aspect is emotional realism. Many people report that emotions felt in dreams are more intense or more honest than those experienced while awake. This happens because sleep bypasses social regulation. The brain no longer needs to manage appearance, justification, or suppression. Emotional signals can be processed directly. This does not mean dreams are always accurate reflections of reality, but it does mean they access emotional truths that waking logic may avoid. From this perspective, deeper layers of reality are not elsewhere. They are beneath the surface of ordinary perception. Sleep removes the filters that normally keep those layers quiet. It allows awareness to operate in a wider field, where meaning is not forced into words, and cause and effect is not mandatory. This wider field can feel unfamiliar precisely because it is rarely accessed consciously. Importantly, this does not imply that everything encountered in sleep is literal or externally real. The brain is still interpreting, still generating experience, but interpretation itself becomes more fluid. Symbols replace labels, feelings replace explanations, patterns replace narratives. This mode of perception can reveal coherence, where waking thought sees chaos, or possibility where waking thought sees limitation. Once you accept that the brain is capable of operating in this expanded mode, sleep stops looking like an interruption and starts looking like an entry point. A shift in rhythm opens access to information that cannot surface under constant control. And this raises a natural next tension. If the brain can access these deeper layers every night, why do they feel so fleeting, so difficult to recall, and so disconnected from waking memory? The answer may have less to do with what happens during sleep, and more to do with how consciousness crosses back over when the rhythms change again. Lucid dreams and out-of-body experiences have long been dismissed as delusions because they don't fit comfortably inside the everyday rules of perception. They disrupt the assumption that awareness must always be anchored to the physical body and governed by sensory input. For a long time, the simplest solution was to label them as errors, hallucinations produced by a confused brain. But as research has deepened, that explanation has begun to look less like clarity and more like avoidance. A lucid dream is a state in which the dreamer knows they are dreaming while the dream continues. This is not a vague impression or a metaphor. Brain imaging studies show that during lucid dreaming, regions associated with self-awareness and decision-making partially reactivate, while the dream state remains intact. In other words, consciousness does not wake up fully, and the dream does not collapse. Two modes coexist. That alone challenges the idea that consciousness operates in a single on or off configuration. If lucid dreaming were merely a malfunction, it would be chaotic and unstable. Yet experienced lucid dreamers report consistency, memory continuity, and deliberate action within the dream environment. Some can choose to observe rather than control, to explore rather than manipulate. The experience is not one of confusion, but of heightened clarity within an altered framework. This suggests that the brain is not failing to generate reality, but successfully generating a different kind of reality experience. Out-of-body experiences provoke even stronger resistance because they strike at identity itself. People report perceiving themselves from a location outside their physical body, often with a sense of calm detachment rather than panic. Neuroscience has identified correlations between these experiences and activity in areas of the brain involved in spatial integration and body representation, such as the temporoparietal junction. When these systems shift or decouple, the brain's usual map of where I am can reorganize. Skeptics often stop there and declare the case closed. If a brain process can be identified, the experience is assumed to be meaningless beyond that mechanism. But this is a logical shortcut. Identifying how an experience occurs does not automatically explain what it represents or why it carries such coherence. Vision has neural correlates too, yet we don't dismiss the visual world as an illusion simply because we understand how the eyes and brain work together. What makes lucid dreams and out-of-body experiences especially interesting is not their strangeness, but their structure. They follow rules, they have internal logic. Time behaves differently, but not randomly. Perception can feel sharper, not blurrier. Many people report a sense of presence or more real than real awareness, as if attention were no longer diluted by sensory overload or social self-monitoring. This intensity is difficult to reconcile with the idea of a degraded or failing system. Calling these states portals does not mean assuming they open into literal external dimensions. It means recognizing that they are thresholds, points of transition where consciousness operates under a different set of constraints. A portal is not a place, it is a function. It allows passage from one mode of experience to another. Lucid dreams and out-of-body experiences appear when the usual anchors of waking reality loosen, but awareness remains stable enough to observe the shift. In waking life, your sense of self is tightly bound to your body's position, your name, your history, and your goals. During these altered states, that binding relaxes. Awareness becomes less localized. You are still present, still perceiving, still remembering, but the reference point has moved. This relocation of perspective is what makes the experience feel profound. It reveals that the I you identify with daily may be more flexible than you assumed. Importantly, not everyone interprets these experiences the same way. Cultural background, belief systems, and expectations shape how meaning is assigned afterward. This is where self-deception can creep in. Some people rush to grand conclusions, while others dismiss the experience entirely to avoid discomfort. Both reactions miss the opportunity for careful observation. The value lies not in the explanation you adopt, but in what the experience demonstrates about the range of consciousness. There is also a practical reason science has begun to take these states more seriously. Lucid dreaming has been studied as a tool for emotional processing, trauma integration, and skill rehearsal. If it were merely fantasy, it would not produce measurable effects on waking behavior and emotional regulation, yet it does. That means something functional is happening. Consciousness is not escaping reality, it is interacting with it from a different angle. Out-of-body experiences, whether spontaneous or induced, often coincide with moments of deep relaxation, sleep paralysis, or transitions between sleep stages. These are liminal zones where the brain's internal model of reality is being rewritten. Awareness slips through the gap before the new model fully locks in. What is perceived during that gap may feel extraordinary, but the conditions that produce it are natural and repeatable. Seen this way, lucid dreams and out-of-body experiences are not malfunctions to be dismissed, nor proofs of anything supernatural that must be defended. They are access points. They reveal how consciousness behaves when freed from its usual constraints, even briefly. And once you recognize that such access points exist, another question naturally arises. If these states are available, structured, and meaningful, what prevents most people from remembering them clearly or integrating what happens there into waking life? There is a common error that prevents you from remembering what you experience in these states, and it has nothing to do with memory capacity or intelligence. It comes from how waking consciousness rushes back in and immediately tries to take control. The moment you wake up, the mind defaults to its daytime operating system, and in doing so, it overwrites what was just present. The experience isn't lost because it was weak or meaningless. It's lost because it doesn't survive the transition intact. When you wake up, your brain rapidly reorients itself toward the external world. Sensory input floods in. The sense of time snaps back into linear order. Language, identity, and expectation reassert themselves. This shift happens fast, often in seconds. Experiences from altered states like lucid dreams or out-of-body perceptions are encoded in a different format, more emotional, more spatial, more symbolic. They don't translate cleanly into waking logic. When the waking mind demands a clear narrative, the material simply dissolves. This is similar to trying to recall a melody by describing it as a paragraph of text. The information exists, but the format is incompatible. Sleep state experiences are not stored the way waking memories are. They are not indexed by chronology or verbal detail. They are held as impressions, movements, atmospheres, and relationships. When you wake up and immediately start thinking, labeling, or checking the time, you activate systems that are not designed to retrieve that kind of data. Another part of the error is the assumption that remembering means reconstructing. People often try to figure out what they dreamed, interrogating the memory as if it were a puzzle to be solved. This analytical pressure collapses the subtle traces that are still present. What remains are fragments, usually the most dramatic or visual ones, while the deeper coherence fades. The mistake is not forgetting, it is forcing recall through the wrong channel. There is also a cultural bias at play. From an early age, we are trained to privilege waking consciousness as the only valid mode of awareness. Anything that happens outside it is treated as secondary, imaginary, or disposable. This attitude shapes how seriously the mind treats those experiences during recall. If the waking self implicitly devalues them, the brain does not invest energy in preserving them. Attention is the currency of memory. What you don't respect, you don't retain. Physiologically, the transition from sleep to wakefulness involves a rapid neurochemical shift. Neurotransmitters associated with focus, action, and external orientation surge. Those associated with openness and associative processing recede. This chemical change is efficient, but it is not gentle. It prioritizes readiness over continuity. The brain is doing what it evolved to do: prepare you to function in the physical world. In the process, it sacrifices the continuity of inner experience. This explains why some people remember dreams vividly when they wake slowly, but forget them completely when an alarm jolts them awake. The issue is not the dream's intensity, but the abruptness of the switch. A sharp return to alertness favors survival, not integration. The subtler the experience, the easier it is to erase. There is also an emotional component. Some sleep state experiences carry a sense of depth, vulnerability, or unfamiliar perspective that can feel destabilizing. The waking mind may unconsciously avoid holding on to them. Forgetting, in this case, is not a failure, but a defense. It protects the familiar identity from being challenged too quickly. This is another way the error operates, not as a lack of access, but as an automatic correction toward normalcy. What makes this especially important is that the forgetting often convinces people that nothing happened. They conclude that sleep was blank, empty, or purely mechanical. In reality, the experience occurred, but the bridge back was poorly built. This reinforces the cycle. Because nothing is remembered, nothing is valued. Because nothing is valued, attention during transitions remains crude and rushed. The irony is that memory loss here does not mean absence of effect. Even when experiences are not consciously recalled, They can influence mood, intuition, and perception the next day. A sense of clarity, emotional release, or subtle insight may appear without a clear source. People often attribute this to a good night's sleep, without recognizing that something was processed, explored, or reorganized beneath awareness. This suggests that remembering is not the only measure of impact, but it also raises an important tension. If experiences during sleep can shape waking life, even when they are forgotten, what might happen if the transition were handled differently? If the return to waking consciousness were less abrupt, less dismissive, less dominated by immediate tasks, would more of that inner material remain accessible? The common error then is not simply forgetting, it is assuming that waking consciousness should dominate immediately and completely. That assumption cuts the thread too quickly. And once you begin to see that the barrier is not the experience itself, but the way consciousness re-enters the body and the day, it becomes easier to imagine a different possibility. That sleep does more than reset you, that it actively expands you, and that traces of that expansion are already influencing you, even if you haven't learned how to notice where they came from. Consciousness can expand during sleep, and you've probably felt this even if you never used those words for it. It shows up quietly without announcement, often in ways that feel ordinary until you pause and look closer. You wake up with a solution that wasn't there the night before. A heavy emotional knot seems looser, even though nothing external changed. A decision that felt impossible suddenly feels obvious. These shifts don't come from rest alone. They come from an expansion of perspective that happened while you were not trying to control it. During waking life, consciousness is narrowed by necessity. Attention is constantly being directed outward, pulled toward tasks, conversations, expectations, and threats. The mind learns to compress reality into manageable pieces. This compression is efficient, but it is limiting. Sleep loosens that compression. As the demands of the external world fade, awareness gains room to move. It is no longer forced to stay aligned with immediate action or social coherence. In that space, something subtle but powerful happens. Consciousness stretches. This expansion is not dramatic in the way stories about mystical experiences often suggest. It is more like a widening of the internal horizon. While you sleep, awareness is not pinned to a single point of view. It can move across memories, emotions, imagined futures, and abstract connections without friction. The boundaries that normally separate past, present, and possible soften. This allows the mind to integrate information that waking consciousness keeps compartmentalized. You can sense this integration when you wake up feeling lighter, as if something unresolved has been quietly handled. The feeling is not excitement, it is relief. Sometimes it arrives as clarity without explanation. You don't know how you know, but you know. That knowing is the residue of expanded awareness. It didn't come from effort. It came from a state where consciousness was allowed to operate without constant self-monitoring. Another sign of expansion is the way priorities subtly reorganize after sleep. Concerns that felt urgent the day before may lose their emotional charge. Other matters previously ignored may rise in importance. This reordering is not random. It reflects a broader evaluation process that occurs when the mind is not trapped in the immediacy of waking stress. Sleep allows consciousness to step back far enough to see patterns rather than isolated events. This is also why creative breakthroughs so often occur after sleep. Artists, scientists, and problem solvers across disciplines report that their most important insights arrive not during intense focus, but after letting go. The sleeping mind does not follow the same rules as the waking mind. It is less obedient to established assumptions. It explores combinations that logic would normally dismiss. In doing so, it expands the field of what feels possible. Emotionally, this expansion can be felt as well. Sleep gives consciousness access to emotional material that may be too threatening or inconvenient to process during the day. Without the need to maintain composure or consistency, awareness can approach feelings from different angles. Fear can be examined without immediate danger. Grief can surface without explanation. Joy can appear without justification. These experiences are not always remembered as dreams, but their effects remain. There is a common misconception that expansion must feel extraordinary to be real. In truth, the most reliable expansions are quiet. They feel natural, even obvious in hindsight. You simply wake up a little more yourself, though you might struggle to say what changed. That subtlety is part of why these experiences are often overlooked. The waking mind prefers events it can label and narrate. Expansion during sleep resists that kind of ownership. Importantly, this expansion does not mean losing grounding or becoming detached from reality. In healthy sleep, the opposite tends to occur. People who sleep well often report feeling more present, more emotionally regulated, and more resilient. Expansion during sleep supports functionality during the day. It broadens awareness without dissolving structure. This balance suggests that consciousness is not meant to remain in one fixed mode. It benefits from rhythm, from contraction and expansion, from focus and release. You may have noticed that the nights when you feel most mentally open or emotionally clear the next day are not always the longest or deepest in a technical sense. They are often the nights when sleep feels complete. This completeness is not measured by hours, but by continuity. Consciousness was able to move through its internal landscape without excessive interruption. It was allowed to finish what it needed to do. This perspective reframes sleep from something passive into something participatory, even if participation is not deliberate. Consciousness expands, not because you try to make it happen, but because the conditions finally allow it. Control steps aside. The internal world becomes spacious enough for awareness to stretch beyond its usual boundaries. Once you recognize that this expansion is a normal, recurring aspect of sleep, another curiosity naturally emerges. If modern experience already hints at consciousness traveling inward, widening and returning changed, it becomes harder to ignore the fact that human cultures long before neuroscience noticed the same pattern. They describe sleep not as emptiness, but as movement, often as a journey. And that raises the question of whether this intuition about expanded consciousness during sleep is a recent discovery, or a very old understanding that was simply expressed in a different language. Did you know that ancient spiritual texts speak of nighttime journeys of the soul not as metaphor, but as a lived and expected dimension of human experience? Long before sleep was reduced to biology and recovery, cultures across the world described the night as a time when consciousness loosened its attachment to the physical world and moved through subtler layers of existence. What is striking is not that these cultures believed this, but how consistently they described it, often without contact with one another, using different symbols to point to the same underlying experience. In ancient Egypt, sleep was not considered an absence of awareness. It was a passage. Texts associated with temple practices describe the soul leaving the body at night to travel through unseen realms, gathering knowledge and restoration before returning at dawn. Dreams were not treated as random images, but as structured encounters, sometimes prophetic, sometimes instructional. Special dream chambers existed where individuals would sleep with the intention of receiving guidance. The assumption was clear. Something real was happening while the body lay still. In Hindu traditions, this idea appears with remarkable philosophical precision. Ancient texts describe multiple layers of self, with waking consciousness representing only one level. Sleep, especially dream states, was seen as a doorway through which awareness could access subtler dimensions of reality. The soul was not thought to be trapped in the body during the night, but temporarily released from its densest obligations. Sleep was described as a rehearsal for death, not in a morbid sense, but as a nightly return to a more essential state of being. Indigenous cultures across the Americas echo this understanding in their own language. Dreams were considered journeys taken by a part of the self that could move freely between worlds. Shamans were often trained not to suppress these experiences, but to navigate them consciously. The dream world was not imaginary, it was parallel. Information gathered there could influence hunting decisions, healing rituals, and communal direction. What mattered was not whether the journey looked real by daylight standards, but whether it brought coherence and balance back to waking life. What unites these traditions is not theology but observation. Humans noticed that sleep changed them. It altered perception, mood, and insight in ways that could not be explained by rest alone. Rather than dismissing this, ancient cultures built frameworks to understand it. They treated the continuity of consciousness seriously. The idea that the soul traveled at night was not poetic indulgence. It was an attempt to describe an experiential pattern that repeated itself generation after generation. It's important to notice how different this approach is from modern habits. Today, we often demand external proof before granting legitimacy to inner experience. Ancient cultures reversed that priority. Repeated subjective experience was considered valid data. If people across time consistently reported encounters, journeys, or expanded awareness during sleep, that pattern mattered. The language of the soul was their best available model for something that felt mobile, aware, and not confined to physical location. These descriptions also reveal an intuitive understanding of transition. Night was not just darkness, it was a threshold. Many traditions emphasized how one entered sleep, not just that one slept. Rituals, prayers, or moments of stillness were meant to prepare consciousness for travel. This suggests they recognize something modern life often ignores, that the shift from waking to sleeping awareness determines what becomes accessible. Sleep was not automatic, it was participatory, even when participation was subtle. You can also see this in how ancient texts speak about forgetting. Many traditions acknowledged that returning from these nighttime journeys often came with partial amnesia. The soul might travel far, but the waking mind could only carry fragments back. This was not seen as failure, but as a limitation of translation. The waking personality could not fully contain what was encountered, so it returned with symbols, emotions, or impressions rather than full narratives. What's remarkable is how closely this aligns with modern observations about memory loss across sleep states. Ancient cultures didn't have EEGs or brain imaging, yet they noticed the same phenomenon. Something happens, something meaningful, but not everything crosses back over. Instead of dismissing the experience, they developed myths, symbols, and practices to honor what could be retained. These traditions did not claim that everyone traveled consciously every night. They recognized variation. Some people remembered more, some felt nothing, but the possibility itself was never questioned. The soul's mobility during sleep was assumed, not argued. That assumption shaped how people related to their inner lives. Sleep was not empty time. It was active time, even if its activity followed different rules. Seen from this angle, ancient texts don't feel naive. They feel observational. They may have used symbolic language, but the experiences they pointed to remain recognizable. The sense of having been somewhere, the feeling of return, the quiet knowing that something occurred beyond ordinary awareness. These are not relics of the past. They are still present, just less interpreted. And this brings us to an interesting tension. If cultures thousands of years ago treated sleep as a journey of consciousness, and modern individuals still report similar sensations, expanded awareness, insight, emotional processing, then the question shifts. It's no longer whether these experiences exist, but how different frameworks attempt to explain them. Ancient traditions spoke in terms of soul and realms. Modern science speaks in terms of states and networks, but both are pointing toward the same mystery, that consciousness does not stay fixed when the body rests. Once this parallel becomes clear, another layer opens naturally. Ancient texts didn't just describe journeys. They hinted that reality itself might be layered, and that consciousness could move between those layers. This idea, once relegated to mythology, begins to sound less distant when placed alongside modern theories that question locality, singular timelines, and fixed observation. And that's where the conversation quietly turns toward physics, not as belief, but as possibility. Modern physics is beginning to touch this territory, not by confirming ancient language, but by quietly dismantling assumptions that once made those ideas seem impossible. For much of the 20th century, physics was built on a reassuring premise. Reality is local, linear, and fundamentally objective. Things exist where they are. Time moves forward. Observation merely records what is already there. Within that framework, the idea that consciousness could move, stretch, or access layers of reality during sleep sounded unscientific by definition. There was nowhere for it to go. That certainty has eroded. Slowly, reluctantly, and through mathematics rather than philosophy, Physics has uncovered a universe far stranger than common sense ever suggested. At the quantum level, particles do not behave like solid objects moving through space. They exist as probabilities until measured. They influence one another instantly across distance. They do not occupy single locations in the way classical logic demands. Reality, it turns out, is not as anchored as we assumed. One of the most unsettling implications comes from non-locality. Experiments have shown that entangled particles remain connected regardless of distance, responding to changes as if space were irrelevant. This does not mean information travels faster than light in a simple sense, but it does mean that the universe does not operate strictly through local cause and effect. Separation, at a fundamental level, is not absolute. When this idea first emerged, even the physicists who discovered it were uncomfortable with the consequences. Another crack appears in the role of the observer. In quantum experiments, measurement is not passive. The act of observation influences the outcome. This does not imply that human consciousness magically creates reality, but it does suggest that reality is not fully independent of how it is engaged. The boundary between observer and observed is thinner than classical physics allowed. What exists depends in part on the conditions of interaction. When these ideas are confined to particles and equations, they feel abstract. But when you place them alongside questions of consciousness, sleep, and perception, something interesting happens. If reality itself is not strictly local, not strictly fixed until interaction, then the assumption that consciousness must be locked inside the skull begins to look more like habit than law. Physics does not say that consciousness travels during sleep, but it no longer forbids the question. Theories about multiple dimensions and parallel realities further stretch the imagination. In many modern models, the universe contains more dimensions than the ones we directly perceive. These dimensions are not alternate fantasy worlds. They are mathematical necessities that help equations work. Most of the time they are invisible, compact, or inaccessible, but their existence suggests that reality has depth beyond surface appearance. What we experience may be a slice, not the whole. Time itself has also become less solid. In some interpretations of physics, past, present, and future coexist as a single structure. The sensation of time flowing may be a feature of consciousness rather than a property of the universe. If this is even partially true, then states of awareness that feel timeless during sleep are not anomalies. They may be moments when consciousness is less constrained by the brain's timekeeping mechanisms. It's important to be precise here. Physics is not validating spiritual narratives, nor is it claiming that dreams are excursions into other universes. What it is doing is removing the intellectual barriers that once made such ideas automatically absurd. The universe is no longer a sealed box with clear edges. It is a dynamic field of relationships, probabilities, and interactions. Within such a universe, consciousness becomes harder to reduce to a byproduct of neural chemistry alone. Some physicists have begun to openly question whether consciousness should be treated as fundamental rather than emergent. This does not mean it replaces matter, but that it may be woven into the fabric of reality in a way we do not yet understand. If that were the case, altered states of consciousness would not be errors or glitches. They would be variations in how a fundamental property of the universe expresses itself through biological systems. Sleep, then, becomes an intriguing case study. During sleep, sensory input is minimized, the brain's predictive models loosen, and awareness turns inward. If consciousness is sensitive to context, as physics suggests reality itself is, then changing the brain's operating conditions could change how consciousness relates to the wider field of reality. This is not mystical, it is structural. Different constraints produce different experiences. What makes this convergence so compelling is its restraint. Modern physics does not make promises, it offers no comfort. It simply reveals that the universe is not as simple as we once believed. And in that complexity, questions that were once dismissed gain new legitimacy. Not answers, questions. This creates a subtle but important shift. Instead of asking whether ancient intuitions about nighttime journeys were true or false, We can ask whether they were early attempts to describe experiences that arise naturally when consciousness interacts with a layered, non-local reality through a biological interface. Language changes, models evolve, the experience remains. And once physics opens the door to a reality that is interconnected, multi-layered, and dependent on perspective, another question emerges almost inevitably. If consciousness can interact with reality in different ways depending on state, then sleep is not just a passive condition. It may be one of the few times when the noise of daily life drops low enough for that interaction to become noticeable. Which leads to a more intimate possibility, that sleep is not only where consciousness goes, but where it briefly reconnects with something essential about what it is. What if sleeping is actually your daily chance to reconnect with who you really are, not as a poetic idea, but as a practical reality that repeats every night? During the day, identity becomes layered with roles, expectations, unfinished conversations, and constant self-correction. You are not false in that state, but you are compressed. Parts of you are emphasized because they are useful, while others remain quiet because they don't help you navigate schedules, responsibilities, or social dynamics. Sleep loosens that compression. When you fall asleep, the structures that maintain your daytime identity begin to soften. The internal voice that explains, defends, and anticipates gradually loses authority. Attention withdraws from the outer world and turns inward, but not in the deliberate way meditation asks for. It happens naturally. Without effort, consciousness slips beneath the surface personality you perform during the day. What remains is not emptiness. It is something more basic, more continuous, and less defined by circumstance. This is why many people feel most like themselves in moments they can't fully explain, a quiet certainty upon waking, a sense of alignment that doesn't come from achievement, a feeling of recognition rather than discovery. These moments don't announce themselves as revelations. They feel familiar, almost obvious, as if you've remembered something rather than learned it. That familiarity is the signature of reconnection. Waking life encourages fragmentation. You switch contexts constantly, adapting to different environments and demands. Over time, this adaptation can make identity feel scattered. Sleep reverses that movement. It gathers what has been spread out. Experiences, emotions, and impressions that were separated by hours or social roles are brought into contact with one another. Consciousness is no longer managing impressions for the outside world. It is relating to itself. This is also why the sense of time changes so dramatically in sleep. Without schedules or clocks, awareness is freed from sequence. You may experience memories from childhood, alongside concerns about the future, not as a timeline but as a single field. In that field, the self is not defined by age or biography. It is defined by presence. This presence is often what people mean when they say, "I felt like myself again," even if they can't articulate why. Importantly, this reconnection is not about becoming someone new. It is about shedding layers that are situational. Sleep doesn't add identity. It subtracts noise. The ego relaxes, not because it is destroyed, but because it is no longer required. There is nothing to prove, protect, or maintain. In that absence of pressure, the deeper continuity of self becomes perceptible. You can notice this effect indirectly. After meaningful sleep, your reactions tend to soften. You are less defensive, less reactive, more able to tolerate ambiguity. These shifts are not moral achievements. They are signs that consciousness has recently touched a wider context. When you feel more spacious inside, it is easier to respond rather than react. That spaciousness does not come from willpower. It comes from reconnection. This also explains why chronic sleep deprivation erodes more than energy. It narrows identity. Without regular access to this nightly reset, the self becomes rigid, overly identified with immediate concerns. Perspective collapses. Everything feels urgent, personal, and exhausting. In that state, it's easy to believe that who you are is nothing more than your stress responses. Sleep quietly corrects that illusion by returning you to a broader sense of being. From this angle, sleep is not an escape from life. It is a return to its foundation. The mind stops negotiating with appearances and reconnects with what feels internally coherent. This coherence doesn't need to be named. Yet it's felt as alignment, ease, or a sense that things make sense again, even if circumstances haven't changed. What's striking is how little control is required for this to happen. You don't have to understand it. You don't have to remember anything specific. Reconnection occurs simply because the conditions allow it. When external demands fall away, consciousness naturally gravitates toward its own center of gravity. That center is not an idea or belief. It is an experience of being that precedes explanation. This reframes the act of going to sleep. Instead of viewing it as surrender to unconsciousness, it can be seen as a daily meeting with the part of you that isn't defined by performance or memory. You don't arrive there by effort. You arrive by letting go. And although you may not bring back clear images or stories, you often return changed in subtle but meaningful ways. Once you start to see sleep as a reconnection rather than a shutdown, the question of where consciousness goes becomes less abstract. It doesn't have to go anywhere exotic. It may simply be returning to a more fundamental version of itself, one that is usually overshadowed by noise. And if that reconnection happens every night, quietly shaping perception and behavior, then sleep is not just preparation for the next day. It is a reminder, repeated daily, of who you are beneath everything you do. You don't shut down when you sleep. You don't disappear. What actually happens is quieter and far more profound. You shift. The noise of the surface world fades, the rigid edges of identity soften, and consciousness enters another mode of being. Not imaginary, not random, but different. A plane where time loosens, where insight doesn't need effort, where parts of you that are drowned out during the day finally have space to speak. Sleep is not an interruption of life. It is a continuation of it, experienced through another lens. So the next time you go to sleep, remember this. You are not escaping the world. You are setting out on a journey you take every night, whether you notice it or not. A journey where your consciousness learns, reorganizes, and quietly reconnects with something essential. And when you wake up, you don't come back empty-handed. You return subtly changed, even if you can't explain why. If you made it all the way here, write this phrase in the comments. I remember the journey. That way I know you reached the end. And if this perspective resonated with you, watch one of the videos appearing on the screen right now. If you want more content like this, that's where the journey continues.